The frozen ground beneath Hans Müller's feet vibrated as endless columns of armoured vehicles moved westward through the December darkness. Sitting in a half-track's rear compartment, the Obergefreiter observed the seemingly infinite procession of panzers vanishing into the Eifel forests. Everything was set for tomorrow. Tomorrow would bring Germany's counter-offensive. Tomorrow the Reich would demonstrate to the world that victory remained achievable. His diary lay open before him, numb fingers clutching a pen as he formed words that would mean his execution if discovered by commanding officers. The official line promised this offensive would fracture the Allied coalition and force peace negotiations. Müller desperately wanted to believe such pronouncements. Every fibre of his being yearned for this to be true. Yet he had witnessed Germany's cities transformed into burning ruins by aerial bombardment. Now they marched toward Belgium carrying barely sufficient fuel to reach the Meuse River, let alone their ultimate destination of Antwerp. The calculations refused to add up properly, and somewhere in every soldier's consciousness lurked the awareness that the mathematics of this operation were fundamentally flawed. Along a 75-mile stretch of front extending from Monschau to Echternach, more than 200,000 German soldiers made final preparations for what the Supreme Commander had designated Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein. The operation's name itself constituted deliberate misdirection, implying defensive measures along Germany's western frontier while concealing the Wehrmacht's final desperate attempt to reverse World War II's trajectory. The operational concept verged on fantasy in its audacity. 3 German armies would smash through thinly defended American sectors in the Ardennes forest, establish crossings over the Meuse, then drive 100 miles to seize Antwerp. This would sever British and American forces, compelling negotiated settlement in the west. Such an outcome would permit Germany to redirect all remaining strength against Soviet armies advancing from the east. Senior field commanders who heard the Supreme Leader present this scheme in mid-November sat in stunned silence. The dictator had personally conceived every element, dismissing objections from General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt and General Feldmarschall Walter Model as defeatist thinking. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army with the rank of General der Panzertruppe, endured the planning conferences at the Wolf's Lair with mounting apprehension. His extensive Eastern Front experience, where his tank divisions had repeatedly defeated Soviet offensives through superior tactical employment and mobility, gave Manteuffel perhaps the finest understanding of armoured warfare among active German officers. He comprehended what this operation required, and he understood that Germany no longer possessed the necessary resources. During a private audience on December 2nd, Manteuffel carefully outlined his concerns to the Supreme Commander. Successful execution demanded achieving surprise, favourable weather conditions preventing Allied air operations, rapid forward movement to forestall American reinforcement, and critically, capture of intact American fuel storage facilities, because German supplies could sustain only the initial assault phase. Without perfect alignment of these factors, the offensive would collapse. The Austrian corporal waved these objections aside, insisting German soldiers' superior willpower and fighting determination would overcome material disadvantages. What the Führer refused to acknowledge was that superior willpower could not propel armour without gasoline, could not manufacture ammunition for artillery pieces, could not replace the 800 aircraft and 1,500 tanks Germany would commit to an operation with perhaps 10% probability of success. The force assembled for Wacht am Rhein represented Germany's final strategic reserve. SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army would deliver the primary thrust northward, driving past Liège toward Antwerp. Despite commanding Germany's most powerful armoured formation, Dietrich had never demonstrated operational-level competence. A loyal party member and personal favourite since the movement's earliest days, Dietrich had advanced through ranks based on political reliability rather than military capability. Von Rundstedt privately characterised him as decent but stupid, while Model had protested the appointment unsuccessfully. Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army would attack through the central sector toward Bastogne and Namur before wheeling northward to link with Dietrich's forces. Southward, General de Panzertruppe Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army would shield the offensive's southern flank using infantry divisions lacking mobility or firepower to accomplish more than delaying American counterattacks. On paper, the figures appeared impressive. Over 400,000 men would participate across various offensive stages. Approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 2,600 artillery pieces, and 1,000 combat aircraft had been gathered from across the shrinking Reich. These statistics concealed devastating shortcomings. Many of the 30 divisions allocated to the offensive were reconstituted formations filled with teenagers and men over 40 who had received minimal training. The panzer divisions, while equipped with formidable Tiger and Panther tanks, lacked sufficient support vehicles, spare components, and most critically, fuel. Staff calculations indicated the offensive possessed enough gasoline for 30 to 40-mile advances. The Meuse River lay 80 miles from assembly positions. Antwerp stood 125 miles distant. Success depended entirely upon seizing American fuel dumps intact during the opening days. Should the Americans destroy their petroleum stores, the entire German armoured spearhead would halt deep within enemy territory. The deception had been executed masterfully. Radio silence, nocturnal movement patterns, and the code names suggesting defensive operations prevented Allied intelligence from detecting the massive concentration. American commanders believed Germany incapable of mounting major offensive action at this war stage. The Ardennes sector where the blow would fall was held by 4 inexperienced or battle-worn divisions resting in what soldiers termed the Ghost Front. However, deception and surprise could carry the offensive only so far. Every German field commander understood that once attack commenced, they would race against time as American reinforcements flooded into the Ardennes. December 16th dawned cold and foggy across the Ardennes. At precisely 5:30 that morning, 1,600 German artillery pieces erupted in a 90-minute barrage, shattering the winter silence. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, commanding a Panzer IV tank in the 2nd Panzer Division, had experienced Soviet artillery bombardments on the Eastern Front that made this preparation seem modest. Yet he watched American positions disintegrate under the shell fire with grim satisfaction. Perhaps their pessimism had been misplaced. Perhaps surprise and violence of action would prove sufficient. His tank lurched forward as infantry assault waves advanced. Behind him, dozens of panzers rolled toward Belgium, engines roaring through morning mist. In the turret, Zimmermann checked his fuel gauge, 3/4 full. Sufficient to reach the Meuse if they moved rapidly, if they encountered no obstacles, if everything proceeded according to plan. Every tanker in the column understood that a very heavy burden rested on that word if. The 6th Panzer Army's northern assault encountered immediate difficulties. At Lanzerath, a single American reconnaissance platoon supported by artillery observers held an entire German parachute battalion at bay for 10 hours. When SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper, the 6th Army's most powerful armoured battle group, reached Lanzerath that evening, he found the paratroopers still pinned down. Peiper was 29 years old, a former adjutant to Heinrich Himmler who had earned reputation for aggressive armoured tactics on the Eastern Front. Tall, blonde, and fanatically devoted to the SS, Peiper commanded approximately 4,800 men with 117 tanks and numerous support vehicles. His orders were simple: break through American defences and drive to the Meuse without halting, without regard for flanks, seizing bridges before demolition. He was the spearhead of the spearhead, and his success or failure would determine the entire offensive's outcome. Furious at the delay, Peiper ordered his tanks forward at midnight, leading the column personally. His Kampfgruppe wound through narrow forest roads in darkness, engine noise echoing through valleys. The attack plan had allocated 12 hours to reach the Meuse. He was already 6 hours behind schedule and had not yet broken free of American defensive positions. At Honsfeld, Piper's tanks overran American positions, capturing vehicles, supplies, and hundreds of prisoners. The Americans had been caught completely unprepared, some still sleeping when German tanks rumbled into their bivouac areas. Piper paused only to refuel from captured American dumps before pushing westward. His columns stretched for miles through dark forest, a river of steel flowing toward the Meuse. However, narrow roads built for agricultural traffic, not armour, created massive congestion. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and self-propelled guns backed up for hours, consuming precious fuel while idling in the cold. On December 17th, at a crossroads near Borgny outside Malmedy, elements of Kampfgruppe Piper encountered an American convoy from Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After brief firefight, the Americans surrendered. What transpired next would haunt the offensive and guarantee no quarter would be given for the remainder. German SS troops herded approximately 120 American prisoners into a field and opened fire with machine guns. Those who survived the initial volley and attempted escape were hunted down and shot. Wounded men were finished with pistol rounds to the head. When finished, 84 Americans lay dead in the snow. Word of the massacre spread through American units with terrifying velocity, replacing shock and confusion with cold fury. American soldiers who had been prepared to surrender when facing overwhelming German assaults now fought with desperate ferocity. The massacre at Malmedy transformed the battle's character, ensuring Americans would yield no ground willingly. In Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army sector, the offensive achieved greater initial success. Manteufel had argued successfully for attacking without preliminary artillery bombardment, achieving even more complete surprise. His forces smashed through positions held by the 106th Infantry Division, encircling 2 entire regiments. Nearly 9,000 American soldiers surrendered over following days, the largest mass capitulation of United States forces in the European theatre. Manteufel's tanks raced toward vital road junctions at Saint-Vith and Bastogne, keys to the Ardennes road network. If these towns fell quickly, nothing could prevent German advance to the Meuse. Oberst Meinrad von Lauchert, commanding 2nd Panzer Division, drove his tanks forward with reckless velocity. His lead elements bypassed American strongpoints, leaving them for follow-on infantry while his panzers pushed deeper into Belgium. On maps at 5th Army headquarters, the penetration looked decisive. German forces had advanced up to 20 miles in some sectors. American defences appeared to be collapsing. For one brief moment, it seemed possible the Supreme Commander's gamble might succeed. However, Lieutenant Friedrich Rathke, a veteran panzer officer, watched the fuel gauge on his Panther tank with mounting anxiety. They had advanced 15 miles and already consumed half their fuel. The narrow roads wound through thick forest, preventing cross-country movement. Every bypass, every detour to avoid demolished bridges consumed more gasoline. His company had started the offensive with 22 tanks. 3 had broken down from mechanical problems, victims of inadequate maintenance and worn-out engines. German industry was producing excellent tanks but lacked spare parts to keep them operational. Rathke's crew had been told to expect captured American fuel dumps along their route. They had encountered nothing but destroyed supply points where retreating Americans had incinerated everything before falling back. The mathematics were becoming clear. At this rate, they would exhaust fuel somewhere between Saint-Vith and the Meuse. And tanks without fuel were nothing but steel coffins awaiting American aircraft. The weather, Germany's greatest ally, began shifting on December 18th. The fog and clouds that had grounded Allied air forces started thinning. American fighter bombers appeared over the battlefield, attacking German columns with devastating effect. Hauptmann Hans Schmidt, commanding a company of Panzer Grenadiers, watched P-47 Thunderbolts strafe his column, destroying 3 trucks and a half-track in seconds. The fighters appeared without warning, diving through gaps in the clouds to unleash rockets and cannon fire before climbing back into the overcast. Against aircraft, German forces were nearly defenceless. The Luftwaffe had promised fighter cover, but few German planes appeared. Most of Germany's remaining aircraft had been held back to support a separate operation, and fuel shortages limited combat sorties. American planes appeared with increasing frequency, leaving German vehicles burning along roadways. The advance slowed repeatedly as units took cover, waiting for the fighters to pass. At La Glaise, Piper's Kampfgruppe had ground to a halt, surrounded by American forces and completely out of fuel. From 4,800 men and 117 tanks, Piper now commanded fewer than 800 soldiers and 25 armoured vehicles, immobilised by empty fuel tanks. American artillery pounded the village continuously. American infantry and tanks tightened the noose. On December 22nd, a Luftwaffe resupply drop intended to deliver fuel and ammunition to Piper's trapped force scattered across the countryside, 90% of supplies falling outside German lines. Piper radioed for permission to break out on foot, abandoning his vehicles. The request travelled up the chain of command to Dietrich, who forwarded it to the supreme leader. The answer came back the following day. "Hold your position. Reinforcements are coming." But Piper knew no reinforcements would arrive. American forces held every approach route. His men were eating their last rations. Wounded soldiers lay in cellars with minimal medical care. On December 23rd, Piper made the decision to withdraw without authorization. That night, 800 survivors abandoned their tanks and vehicles, slipping through American lines on foot to reach German positions days later. Kampfgruppe Piper, the most powerful armoured formation in the offensive, had been destroyed without achieving any strategic objective. The pattern repeated across the entire front. At Saint-Vith, American defenders held out far longer than German planners anticipated, tying up critical road junctions until December 21st. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions created an impenetrable northern shoulder that channeled the 6th Panzer Army into narrow valleys where American artillery slaughtered German infantry attempting breakthrough. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division arrived just before German forces could seize the town, creating a fortress that absorbed attack after attack. General Lieutenant Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding 47th Panzer Corps, sent a surrender ultimatum to the American commander on December 22nd. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply entered military legend. Nuts. When German officers requested clarification, they were informed it meant go to hell. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne through Christmas, while Manteufel's panzers attempted to bypass the town and continue westward. However, roads radiating from Bastogne were essential for supply and reinforcement. Without controlling the town, German forces could not sustain their westward advance. December 24th brought weather German planners had dreaded. Clear skies dawned over the Ardennes for the first time in a week. Within hours, the sky filled with Allied aircraft. Over 5,000 sorties flew that day, hammering German supply columns, attacking stalled tank formations, and dropping supplies to surrounded American forces. Feldwebel Karl Mayer, commanding a Tiger tank battalion, watched in helpless fury as P-47 fighter bombers methodically destroyed his supply convoy. Without ammunition, his Tigers were useless. Without fuel, they could not move. American fighter pilots had learned to target fuel trucks first, knowing that immobilized German armor could be dealt with later. Meyer's battalion, which had started the offensive with 45 Tigers, was down to 19 operational vehicles. The rest had been abandoned for lack of fuel, destroyed by air attack, or knocked out in close-quarter fighting. The Tiger, Germany's most formidable tank, possessed armour that could shrug off most American tank rounds and an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied vehicle at long range. None of that mattered when the tanks sat motionless, their fuel tanks empty, while American fighter bombers circled overhead like vultures. By December 25th, the offensive had reached its high-water mark. Elements of 2nd Panzer Division had pushed to within 4 miles of the Meuse River near Dinant, the deepest German penetration. However, this spearhead was cut off, surrounded and out of fuel. To the north, British tanks of the 30th Corps held the Meuse crossings in strength. To the south, Patton's Third Army had disengaged from its positions in Lorraine, pivoted 90 degrees north, and slammed into the southern flank of the German salient. The weather had turned decisively against Germany. American artillery spotters called down devastating fire on German positions with complete visibility. Allied logistics functioned with machine-like efficiency, delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily while German supply columns burned under air attack. The bulge that gave the battle its name had reached maximum extension. Now the Allies were going to squeeze it shut. Hauptmann Otto Krebs, who had commanded a Panzer Grenadier company through the opening days of the offensive, sat in a frozen foxhole near Bastogne on Christmas Day, trying to comprehend what had gone wrong. They had achieved complete surprise. They had broken through American lines. They had advanced up to 30 miles in some sectors. And yet they had failed. The Americans had not collapsed. Every small town became a fortress. Every crossroads a battlefield. His company had started with 160 men. 48 remained combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. They had no ammunition for their mortars, barely enough rifle rounds for one more engagement, and no prospect of resupply because American aircraft controlled the roads. Christmas dinner consisted of frozen bread and weak coffee. Meanwhile, Krebs could hear American artillery firing continuously, the shells supplied by an endless logistical network that seemed to have no limit. He had fought on the Eastern Front. He had seen massive Soviet offensives that crushed German positions through sheer weight of numbers and material. This was different. The Americans fought with precision, with coordination between infantry, armour, artillery and aircraft that the Soviets never achieved. And they did it while keeping their soldiers well-fed, well-equipped and supported by a logistics system that defied belief. At German headquarters, the reality of failure slowly penetrated layers of denial. Model and von Rundstedt repeatedly requested permission to withdraw, to pull back before American counterattacks encircled and destroyed the entire German force. The Supreme Commander refused. He ordered renewed attacks toward the Meuse, insisting that victory remained possible if commanders showed sufficient determination. On December 26th, Patton's 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne, opening a corridor into the besieged town. The Americans immediately began pouring reinforcements and supplies into Bastogne, transforming it from a defensive position into a base for counterattacks. Manteufel's forces, which had bypassed Bastogne thinking it contained only a small garrison, now found a reinforced American strongpoint in their rear, threatening their supply lines and blocking roads they needed for retreat. January 1st, 1945, brought the Luftwaffe's final major operation of the war, Operation Bodenplatte. Over 900 German aircraft launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, destroying approximately 200 Allied planes on the ground. For a few hours, it seemed Germany could still strike devastating blows. However, the operation had been a strategic disaster. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 280 aircraft destroyed, with more than 230 pilots killed, missing or captured, including wing commanders, squadron leaders, and irreplaceable experienced aviators. The Allies replaced their lost planes within days. Germany would never recover the pilots or aircraft lost in what proved to be the Luftwaffe's death blow against itself. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's highest-scoring fighter pilots, watched the returning aircraft land with growing horror as the losses became clear. The Luftwaffe had gambled everything on one operation and lost. From this point forward, German forces would fight without meaningful air cover while Allied fighter bombers hunted them relentlessly. The German offensive had created a bulge 60 miles deep and 40 miles wide at its base, but it had failed to reach any strategic objective. The Meuse remained in Allied hands. Antwerp was unthreatened. Allied armies had not been split or encircled. Most critically, the offensive had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves of men, tanks, fuel and ammunition, Every panzer division committed to the Ardennes was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Replacements did not exist. New tanks could not be produced in sufficient numbers. Fuel reserves were exhausted. The offensive had burned through supplies that had taken months to accumulate, supplies that Germany could never replace. On January 3rd, the Americans launched major counterattacks from north and south, aiming to pinch off the Bulge and trap German forces inside. The Führer finally authorized a limited withdrawal on January 8th, but by then the opportunity for organized retreat had passed. German forces fell back under constant pressure, fighting desperate rearguard actions while American forces hammered them from ground and air. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a tank commander in the 9th Panzer Division, recorded the final days of the offensive in letters never sent, found among his possessions after his death in February 1945. "We are destroying our own vehicles for lack of fuel to move them. Every road is choked with abandoned equipment. The Americans pursue us day and night, their aircraft appearing whenever the weather clears, their artillery following us with uncanny accuracy. We started this offensive believing we could change the war's outcome. Now we fight simply to escape the trap we created for ourselves. The men no longer speak of victory. They speak only of reaching the Siegfried Line alive, of finding shelter from American shells and bombs, of somehow surviving what we all understand is the beginning of the end. We gambled everything on the Ardennes and we have lost. Germany possesses no more reserves, no more fuel, no more illusions. The Russians are coming from the east, the Americans and British from the west, and we have exhausted ourselves in one final futile offensive that gained nothing except to hasten our own destruction." By January 25, 1945, the Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The statistics told the story of catastrophic failure. Germany committed approximately 400,000 men to the offensive. Between 80,000 and 100,000 became casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. Approximately 12,000 were killed. The Wehrmacht lost 600 tanks and assault guns, vehicles that could never be replaced. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable pilots. German fuel reserves, which had taken months to accumulate, were completely exhausted. Artillery ammunition, carefully stockpiled for the offensive, was gone. The offensive had consumed Germany's capacity to conduct major operations. Never again would Germany launch an attack of such scale. The Americans suffered approximately 81,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. However, unlike Germany, America could replace these losses. Ships from America arrived daily with fresh divisions, new equipment, and endless supplies. The American dead would be mourned, but their loss would not cripple American military operations. Germany's dead, wounded, and captured represented losses that could never be made good. More significant than immediate casualties was the strategic cost. The offensive delayed Allied plans to cross the Rhine by approximately 6 weeks. However, it also delayed Soviet operations in the east, as Stalin had launched a massive winter offensive on January 12th, forcing Germany to shift reinforcements eastward at the moment when they were most needed to defend the Ardennes. The dictator had gambled that decisive victory in the west would allow Germany to concentrate against the Soviets. Instead, the Ardennes consumed forces desperately needed in the east while achieving nothing in the west. When the Soviets launched their Vistula-Oder offensive, they encountered weakened German defences and advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks, reaching the Oder River less than 50 miles from Berlin. The panzer divisions destroyed in the Ardennes could have slowed, though not stopped, this advance. Instead, they lay wrecked in Belgian forests, monuments to strategic delusion. Oberst Hermann Gessner, who had commanded a Volksgrenadier division in the offensive, wrote a detailed after-action report that was never submitted because by the time he finished writing it, there was no longer a functioning command structure to receive such reports. His analysis was brutally honest. The Ardennes offensive failed because it was based on assumptions that had no basis in reality. We assumed complete surprise, which we achieved. We assumed bad weather would ground Allied aircraft, which occurred for 1 week. We assumed rapid advance would prevent American reinforcement, which proved impossible on roads designed for farm traffic, not armoured columns. We assumed captured American fuel would sustain our advance, but the Americans destroyed their supplies, or we could not reach them. We assumed American forces would collapse under the initial assault. Instead, even newly arrived divisions fought with determination that delayed our advance at every crossroads. We assumed our will to win would overcome material disadvantages, as if courage could be substituted for gasoline, determination could replace ammunition, and fighting spirit could overcome absolute Allied air superiority. Most fundamentally, we assumed that because the Supreme Leader ordered an offensive, that offensive must succeed. This was not military planning. This was magical thinking, and it has destroyed the last forces capable of defending Germany. The aftermath of the offensive brought consequences far beyond simple military defeat. The 6th Panzer Army, which had achieved so little in the Ardennes, was ordered to Hungary for a final offensive near Lake Balaton. This attack, launched in March 1945, failed completely against Soviet defences, and the 6th Panzer Army was effectively destroyed. Dietrich survived the war and was tried for war crimes at Malmedy, receiving a life sentence that was later reduced. He was released from prison in 1955 and died in 1966, never acknowledging the massacre his forces committed. Piper was also convicted for war crimes at Malmedy, initially sentenced to death, later reduced to life imprisonment, and released in 1956. He moved to France, where he lived under an assumed name until 1976, when his identity was discovered. His house was firebombed and Piper was killed, the old massacre finally catching up with him 31 years after the events at Baugny Crossroads. Manteuffel survived the war, surrendered to the British, and served a brief prison term. He later entered West German politics, serving in the Bundestag and coining the term Bundeswehr for West Germany's new armed forces. He lectured at West Point about the Ardennes campaign, analysing how American flexibility and logistics defeated German armoured tactics. In interviews during the 1970s, Manteuffel was candid about the offensive's futility. From a purely military standpoint, the Ardennes attack made no sense. Germany lacked the resources to reach Antwerp. We lacked the fuel to sustain an advance beyond the Meuse. We lacked the air power to protect our columns from Allied fighter bombers. We lacked the reserves to exploit any breakthrough we achieved. The offensive succeeded tactically in achieving surprise and breaking through American lines. It failed operationally because we could not sustain the advance. It failed strategically because even if we had reached Antwerp, which was impossible, such success would not have forced Allied negotiation or changed the war's fundamental outcome. Germany was already defeated. The Ardennes offensive simply accelerated the final collapse. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the difference between tactical proficiency and strategic reality. German soldiers fought with skill and determination throughout the offensive. German commanders executed complex operations under difficult conditions. German tank crews showed tactical superiority in individual engagements. None of it mattered because Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the logistics, and the resources to sustain offensive operations. The Americans had been surprised and badly hurt, but their response illustrated the power of material superiority and organizational depth. Within days, Eisenhower had shifted divisions across hundreds of miles, reorganized command structures, and concentrated overwhelming force against the German penetration. American logistics delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily despite winter weather and damaged roads. American industry replaced every lost tank, every destroyed truck, every expended artillery shell. The Battle of the Bulge was not won by superior American tactics or battlefield performance. In many engagements, German forces demonstrated higher tactical skill. The battle was won by American logistics, by industrial capacity that could absorb losses and replace them overnight, by an army that could shift corps-sized formations hundreds of miles in response to crisis, and by complete air superiority that allowed American fighters to hunt German columns at will. For Germany, the Ardennes represented the death of strategic flexibility. After the offensive collapsed, the Wehrmacht fought purely defensive operations. The initiative passed completely to the Allies. In the east, Soviet armies advanced inexorably toward Berlin. In the west, American and British forces prepared to cross the Rhine. Germany's cities were systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. Oil production collapsed under air attack. Transportation networks disintegrated. Food supplies ran short. The industrial capacity that had sustained the war was crumbling. German soldiers no longer fought for victory. They fought to delay defeat, to keep Allied armies away from German cities for another day, another week, another month. They fought because the alternative was surrender, and they had been conditioned to believe surrender was betrayal. They fought because despite everything, despite the destroyed cities and the millions dead and the complete hopelessness of their position, the Nazi regime still held Germany in its grip. The offensive delayed the end by perhaps 6 weeks. That was the sum total of German achievement. For this delay, Germany sacrificed its last mobile reserves, ensuring that when the Allies finally crossed the Rhine, they encountered weakened defences that collapsed rapidly. For this delay, Germany sacrificed panzer divisions desperately needed to defend against Soviet offensives in the east. For this delay, Germany consumed fuel reserves that might have powered a fighting withdrawal that could have prolonged resistance. The Ardennes offensive was the Supreme Leader's last gamble, and it was a catastrophic failure, perhaps the most expensive failure of the entire war, because it consumed resources Germany could not afford to lose in pursuit of objectives Germany could never achieve. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, who had participated in the opening assault as an infantryman in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, survived the war and recorded his memories in the 1960s. His account captured the transformation German soldiers experienced during the offensive. We began with hope bordering on euphoria. Finally, we were attacking again. Finally, we would strike a decisive blow against the Americans. The first days seemed to confirm our hopes. American units retreated. We advanced. We captured supplies and equipment. But by the 4th day, reality asserted itself. American resistance stiffened. American artillery fire increased. American counterattacks drove us from positions we had taken, and always, when the weather cleared, came the aircraft. Day after day, American fighters attacked our columns. They destroyed our supply trucks, our fuel transports, our ammunition carriers. Without supplies, we could not advance. Without fuel, our tanks sat motionless. By Christmas, we understood that the offensive had failed. By New Year's, we understood we would be lucky to escape back to Germany. When we finally withdrew in late January, our division had been destroyed. Of the men who attacked on December 16th, fewer than 1/3 returned to German lines. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. We had lost the war in the Ardennes not because the Americans defeated us in battle, but because we defeated ourselves. We attacked with inadequate resources, impossible objectives, and delusional planning. And 50,000 German soldiers paid with their lives for this delusion. The German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes were not the same men who had conquered France in 1940 or driven deep into the Soviet Union in 1941. Many were teenagers with only weeks of training, thrown into combat equipped with outdated weapons. Others were men in their 40s, pulled from factories and offices to fill depleted ranks. The elite SS divisions still contained combat veterans, but their ranks had been heavily diluted with young recruits who lacked experience. Equipment was a mixture of obsolete weapons, captured material from a dozen different nations, and German vehicles pressed into service despite mechanical unreliability. Logistics functioned poorly because Germany's transportation network was crumbling under air attack. The Wehrmacht that attacked in the Ardennes bore little resemblance to the powerful force that had dominated Europe 4 years earlier. This was an army of exhausted men fighting with worn-out equipment, sustained by increasingly unrealistic ideology and the desperate hope that somehow, against all evidence, Germany might yet avoid complete defeat. However, some elements remained from Germany's earlier victories. German tactical doctrine still emphasized initiative at lower levels. Company and battalion commanders were expected to make decisions and exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from higher command. This flexibility had served Germany well in earlier campaigns. In the Ardennes, it allowed isolated units to continue attacking even when communications failed and the overall offensive had clearly stalled. German tank crews remained highly skilled. The Tiger and Panther tanks, when they had fuel and ammunition, were superior to most Allied armour. German infantry units, when properly led and adequately supplied, fought with determination. None of this changed the strategic reality that Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win against enemies who possessed overwhelming material superiority. Tactical excellence and fighting spirit were insufficient substitutes for industrial capacity, logistics, and air power. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the ultimate bankruptcy of Nazi Germany's strategic position. The dictator's strategy since 1943 had been to inflict sufficient casualties on Germany's enemies that they would negotiate rather than continue fighting. This approach assumed that democracies were weak, that the Allies would crumble under losses, that British and American populations would demand peace once casualties mounted. Every aspect of this thinking proved wrong. The Allies were prepared to accept significant casualties to achieve complete German defeat. When American units were overrun in the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, American commanders responded by rushing reinforcements to contain the breakthrough, not by considering negotiation. When British tanks held the Meuse crossings, denying Germans their primary objective, the British government did not waver in commitment to Germany's unconditional surrender. The Allies understood what the Führer refused to accept. Germany had lost the capacity to alter the war's fundamental trajectory. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but when and at what cost. The Ardennes offensive added approximately 100,000 German casualties to the final bill without changing the answer to either question. What the offensive did accomplish was to eliminate any possibility of Germany negotiating a conditional surrender. The massacre at Malmedy and other atrocities committed by SS forces during the offensive removed any sympathy Allied leaders might have felt for Germany. When Piper's forces gunned down American prisoners, when SS troops murdered Belgian civilians, when German forces committed systematic war crimes throughout their advance, they ensured that Allied demands for unconditional surrender and complete occupation would be non-negotiable. Germany would be defeated totally, occupied completely, and its leadership tried for war crimes. The Ardennes offensive made certain there would be no negotiated peace, no conditional surrender, no opportunity for Nazi leadership to escape justice. By February 1945, when the last German forces retreated to the Siegfried Line, the military situation was hopeless. In the east, Soviet armies had closed to within 60 miles of Berlin. In the west, American and British forces prepared to cross the Rhine in overwhelming strength. Germany's oil production had been reduced to almost nothing by air attack on synthetic fuel plants. German aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Tanks sat immobilized in defensive positions, unable to maneuver for lack of gasoline. German cities were systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Transportation networks were shattered. The economy was collapsing. Food supplies were inadequate. The Nazi regime controlled Germany through terror, executing soldiers for defeatism and hanging civilians suspected of doubting victory. Germany had become a nightmare state fighting for its own destruction, unable to surrender because the regime preferred to destroy Germany rather than admit defeat, unable to win because victory had ceased to be possible. The soldiers who returned from the Ardennes carried with them the knowledge that Germany was finished. They had seen American material superiority firsthand. They had experienced the weight of Allied air power. They had understood the impossibility of defeating enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Some would fight on from loyalty to their units and comrades. Some fought because desertion meant execution. Some fought because the Nazi regime had destroyed their capacity for independent thought, conditioning them to follow orders regardless of consequences. But few fought believing victory remained possible. The Ardennes had been Germany's final offensive effort. From February forward, Germany fought purely defensive battles, delaying actions, hopeless last stands in cities that would be destroyed defending them. The war would continue for 3 more months, but its outcome had been determined. Germany would be defeated, occupied, and divided. The Nazi regime would be destroyed, and millions more would die in the final battles, their deaths purchasing nothing except a brief delay of the inevitable. The Battle of the Bulge, from the German perspective, was a story of delusion, denial, and defeat. It was a story of soldiers sent to accomplish the impossible with inadequate resources by leaders who refused to accept reality. It was a story of tactical proficiency wasted in pursuit of strategic impossibility. It was a story of courage and determination that produced no meaningful result except to hasten the destruction those qualities were meant to prevent. German soldiers in the Ardennes fought as well as any soldiers could be expected to fight under such circumstances. They achieved surprise, broke through enemy lines, advanced deep into Belgium, and inflicted significant casualties on American forces. None of it mattered because the fundamental strategic calculation was wrong. Germany could not defeat the Allied coalition through military operations and lacked the resources for victory. The longer Germany fought, the more completely it would be destroyed. Every German soldier who died in the Ardennes died for nothing, because the offensive could never achieve its objectives, and its failure guaranteed Germany's total defeat. The final accounting was brutal. Germany lost 100,000 men, 600 tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and irreplaceable quantities of fuel and ammunition. In return, Germany delayed Allied operations by 6 weeks and gained absolutely nothing of strategic value. The Ardennes offensive was a catastrophic failure, but it was more than military defeat. It was the death of the last German illusion that the war could still be won. After the Ardennes, even the most fanatical Nazi understood that Germany faced not just defeat but destruction. The offensive consumed the last forces capable of delaying that destruction, ensuring that when the final collapse came, it would be swift and total. The Battle of the Bulge, from the German perspective, was the moment when Germany's fate was sealed, when hope died, when the illusion of possible victory finally shattered against the reality of absolute Allied material superiority. The German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes believed they were fighting for Germany's survival. Instead, they participated in an operation that guaranteed Germany's destruction, ordered by a regime that preferred total catastrophe to admitting error, launched against enemies whose overwhelming material advantages no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last offensive and its final failure, the moment when the mathematics of war proved that willpower and determination were insufficient substitutes for industrial capacity, logistics, and air superiority. From December 16, 1944, when the artillery began, to January 25, 1945, when the last German forces withdrew, Germany waged a battle it could not win, purchased a delay it could not afford, and consumed resources it could never replace. The result was inevitable defeat, hastened by the very offensive intended to prevent it.